I would like to welcome you to this video series dedicated to the Kryptos Sculpture. Whether you're fascinated by cryptography or simply curious about an artwork embedded with cryptographic challenges, you're welcome to join. No prior knowledge of cryptography or mathematics is assumed. Everything will be explained in a clear and accessible manner suitable for everyone. In this inaugural video, I will demonstrate how to solve the first puzzle, known as K1. We'll delve into the sculpture's anatomy, helping you understand its components beyond a mere jumble of letters. Detailed explanations of the cryptographic method used in K1, crucial for understanding, will also be covered. Additionally, we'll follow the steps together to decrypt K1. Throughout the video, I'll highlight intriguing aspects and facts related to both the sculpture and K1. With much ground to cover, let's dive right in. The picture on the left shows what Kryptos looks like in real life. It resembles a sheet of paper or a scroll with lots of letters carved into it. The artwork was commissioned in 1988 by the CIA and entrusted to the artistic vision of Jim Sanborn, an American sculptor. Despite lacking a background in cryptography or mathematics, Sanborn strived to create a work that would present a cryptographic challenge. This is where Ed Scheidt, a retired CIA cryptographer, came into the picture. During the early stages of the project, Sanborn actively sought Scheidt's expertise to ensure the accuracy and level of challenge presented by the cryptographic elements of the sculpture. Scheidt, drawing upon his extensive experience in the field, provided valuable feedback and guidance on the encryption methods employed in the artwork. While Jim Sanborn was the sculptor responsible for physically bringing the vision to life, it can be argued that Ed Scheidt played an equally significant role in the creation of the cryptographic aspect of the sculpture. One could view Sanborn as responsible for the hardware and the messages, the tangible form of the sculpture, while Scheidt's contributions lie in the software, the design and implementation of the cryptographic elements. Let's explore the anatomy of the sculpture next. If you were to transcribe the text from the different panels, it would resemble something like this. As you might notice, the sculpture comprises 4 squares or panels. Please note that the text on the right panels of the sculpture is written from right to left. For convenience, I've rotated it 180 degrees. The left panels contain the ciphertext we're attempting to crack. It's formed from the ciphertext of 4 distinct puzzles concatenated together. What distinguishes them is that each puzzle used a different key and/or encryption method to encrypt its plaintext. So, each puzzle is a short message, encrypted with a unique method and/or key. Solving these puzzles involves finding the method and key used for encryption, then decrypting the message by reversing it. It's worth noting that the encryption methods used belong to classical cryptography, and the encryption can be done with pencil and paper. Hence, no modern computer-based cryptographic methods were used. This is good news because it means that even if someone isn't a cryptographic or mathematical genius, they still have a chance at solving the puzzles. As William F. Friedman, the renowned cryptologist, put it, the main requirement for successfully breaking a cipher was believing it was breakable. The first 3 puzzles were solved back in 1999 by Jim Gilligley, a computer scientist and cryptographer, but the 4th one, K4, remains unsolved to this day. On the right panels, you'll find a Vigenère tableau or square. Vigenère squares are used with a cryptographic method called the Vigenère cipher. Placing a Vigenère square on the sculpture might be interpreted as a hint that some of the ciphertext was encrypted using that particular cipher method. Indeed, both K1 and K2 are encrypted using this specific cipher. So, before we begin solving K1, let's have a brief introduction to the Vigenère cipher. The Vigenère cipher is a polyalphabetic substitution cipher. If this doesn't make any sense to you just yet, don't worry, it will become clear in a couple of minutes. The method was invented and first described by an Italian cryptologist named Giovanni Battista Balasso. In the 19th century, Balasso's cipher was mistakenly attributed to Blaise de Vigenère, acquiring its present name. While the cipher method is easy to understand and implement, it resisted all attempts to break it for almost 3 centuries. Hence, it earned the description, the indecipherable cipher. You will soon see why. Now let's explore how to employ the Vigenère cipher in practice. If Bob and Alice want to communicate using the Vigenère cipher to encrypt their messages, they need to agree on two things beforehand. Firstly, they must select a keyword. Secondly, they must also agree on a configuration for a Vigenère square. Some people call it Vigenère table or Vigenère tableau, which will play an equally important part in the encryption and decryption process as the keyword. But what is a Vigenère square? Here's what a standard Vigenère square looks like. To understand how it's created, let's build it together. We'll begin with the inner part of the table. First, write the letters of the English alphabet in the first line in ascending order. In the second line, we write the same alphabet but shift it one letter to the left. Notice that the second line starts with B and ends with A. In the third line, we shift once more to the left. We continue this process until we have a line starting with each letter of the English alphabet, totaling 26 lines. Notice that although each line contains the same letters, no two lines are identical while each line has different letters in the same positions. In that sense, you could say these are 26 distinct alphabets. Next, we write the standard English alphabet above the shifted alphabets. Typically, this alphabet is used as the plaintext alphabet. Finally, let's write the standard English alphabet from top to bottom on the left side of the inner part of the table. Usually, this alphabet is designated as the key alphabet. At this point, we have everything we need to perform our first encryption and decryption using the Vigenère cipher. In our example, Bob and Alice agreed on the following details. Firstly, they will use the word owl as their keyword. Secondly, they will utilize the standard Vigenère square for their secret communication. Once these decisions were made, they went their separate ways. Later, Alice decides to send the name of the Greek goddess, Athena, to Bob in an encrypted format using the Vigenère cipher. To do this, she needs to recreate the standard Vigenère square, just as we did a minute ago. Then, she writes the keyword under the plaintext. Notice that the key is shorter than the plaintext, so Alice repeats it until she has the same number of characters in the keystream as the length of the plaintext. Next, she performs the encryption letter by letter in the following way. First, she locates the current letter of the plaintext in the plaintext alphabet on the Vigenère square, an A in our example. Then, she finds the corresponding key letter in the key alphabet, an O in our case. Finally, she identifies the letter from the inner part of the square, which is in the same column as the plaintext letter and the same row as the key letter, an O in our example. This becomes the first letter of the ciphertext. Moving to the second position of the plaintext, we have the letter T and a W in the keystream. At the intersection of these two letters on the square, we find the letter P as the next cipher letter. Continuing this process, we obtain the following ciphertext. After successfully encrypting her message, Alice sends the ciphertext to Bob. To decrypt it, Bob also needs to recreate the standard Vigenère square. Then, he writes the keyword under the ciphertext and repeats it to match the length of the keystream with the ciphertext. Following this, he needs to perform the decryption process letter by letter. Firstly, he locates the key letter in the key alphabet, which is O in the first position. Then, in the same row of the inner part of the tableau, he finds the cipher letter, also O in the first position. Finally, he retrieves the letter from the plaintext alphabet in the same column as the cipher letter, which is A in our example. Moving to the second position, the key letter is W, and the cipher letter is P. Bob searches for the letter W in the key alphabet, then finds the letter P in the same row of the inner part. Finally, from the same column as the cipher letter, he obtains the plaintext letter from the plaintext alphabet, which is T in this case. By continuing this process, he will reveal the entire plaintext message. As you've observed, implementing the Vigenère cipher is quite simple and straightforward. Now, let's explore why the Vigenère cipher is classified as a polyalphabetic substitution cipher. In our example, we utilized 3 different alphabets selected from the Vigenère square based on our keyword. Since the keyword will always contain more than one unique letter, we will consistently use more than one alphabet from the Vigenère tableau, thus explaining the polyalphabetic attribute, where poly means several. Moreover, As you've noticed, we replaced the plaintext characters with letters from these alphabets, explaining the substitution attribute. In essence, the Vigenère cipher operates as a polyalphabetic substitution cipher by replacing the original plaintext letters with letters from distinct cipher alphabets designated by the keyword employed during encryption. In classical cryptography, there are two primary cipher types: substitution and transposition ciphers. Substitution ciphers involve replacing the original plaintext letters with others defined by the chosen cipher method. The Vigenère cipher is among the most famous substitution ciphers, alongside the Cipher and the Enigma ciphers, which are also well-known members of the same family. On the other hand, the second main cipher type, transposition ciphers, doesn't alter the letters of the plaintext. Instead, they rearrange or shuffle their order. In Kryptos, K1 and K2 are substitution ciphers, while K3 is a transposition cipher. Let's delve into why the Vigenère cipher gained its moniker, the indecipherable cipher, and remained unbroken for 300 years. In the following example, Alice and Bob aim to make the life of any potential eavesdropper even harder. Instead of using the standard Vigenère square, they opt to agree on a second keyword. This second keyword will be used to create what's known as a keyed Vigenère square. Here's how they incorporate the second keyword. Firstly, they create a keyed alphabet. It's quite simple. They start by writing down the keyword. Next, they continue with the remaining letters of the standard English alphabet, those not used in the keyword, writing them after the keyword in alphabetical order. Using this alphabet, they construct their Vigenère square as previously done. They initiate the inner part of the table by writing their keyed alphabet. Then shift it one letter to the left in the second row. Finally, repeating this shift in subsequent rows until they form 26 rows, each beginning with a letter from the alphabet. Subsequently, they position their keyed alphabet above the inner table as the plaintext alphabet. Finally, they inscribe it from top to bottom on the left side of the inner table as their key alphabet. Let's encrypt the plaintext from the previous example using this keyed Vigenère table and compare it to the result obtained from the standard Vigenère square. The encryption method remains the same. Firstly, we locate the current plaintext character in the plaintext alphabet. Then, we identify the key character in the key alphabet. Finally, we retrieve the letter from the intersection of the column containing the plaintext letter and the row of the key letter from the inner part of the table. In the first position, using the keyed table, we obtain the same cipher letter as with the standard Tableau. Moving to the second position, we continue this process, finding the plaintext letter, then the key letter, and ultimately retrieving the letter from the inner part. As observed, in the second position, the cipher letter differs. Continuing this process results in the following ciphertext, which varies by several characters from the one produced by the standard square. Lastly, I'd like to address creating a keyed alphabet, specifically regarding instances where the keyword contains multiple identical letters. The solution is straightforward. Write down the unique letters from the keyword in the order they first appear. Then, complete the alphabet by writing the remaining letters in ascending order. Up to this point, we've observed the structure of a standard Vigenère square. Subsequently, an example was provided for a keyed Vigenère table, utilizing a single key for both the intersection of the table and the plaintext and key alphabets. However, further complexity can be introduced. For instance, in the third configuration, 3 distinct keys were employed, one for the inner table, another for the plaintext alphabet, and yet another for the key alphabet. Additionally, a shift was applied to the plaintext alphabet, an approach even Vigenère himself recommended in his 1586 book on the subject, aiming to enhance the complexity of this cipher and make it more challenging to decipher. It's worth noting that in the initial 2 examples, the rows in the inner part of the table were shifted to the left, whereas in our third example, they were shifted to the right. While this alteration in the direction of row shifts could be perceived as an added configuration, potentially complicating matters for aspiring codebreakers, this shift direction adjustment carries further implications. Altering the direction of the row shift in the third example renders the Vigenère square asymmetric. But what exactly does that imply? In the first 2 examples, interchangeability exists between the plaintext and key alphabets. When searching for the letter L in the plaintext alphabet or O in the key alphabet, the outcome remains consistent even when you interchange these alphabets and search for L in the key alphabet and O in the plaintext alphabet. In both scenarios, Z emerges as the cipher letter. This equivalence persists in our second example. Even upon swapping alphabets, E remains the resulting cipher letter in both scenarios. Conversely, in the third example, switching between the plaintext and key alphabets produces distinct cipher letters. Consequently, in instances where the Vigenère square exhibits asymmetry, it becomes a must to determine beforehand which alphabet functions as the plaintext alphabet and which as the key alphabet. Lastly, before concluding this section of the video and returning to Kryptos, I'd like to briefly discuss two things. Firstly, while configuring our Vigenère square with these diverse options might suggest the cipher's robustness, even bordering on being impenetrable, that's not entirely accurate. Given a sufficiently long ciphertext, especially if the keyword is short, the Vigenère cipher is relatively easy to break. However, delving into these decryption techniques falls beyond the scope of this video. Yet, if you're interested, numerous resources on the internet cover this topic. However, we'll look into the method that Jim Gilligley, the cryptographer who solved the first 3 puzzles, used to decrypt K1 later. Secondly, you may have already noticed a significant observation. The first row of the plaintext alphabet aligns with the inner part of the Vigenère square, just as the key alphabet corresponds to the first column. This redundancy renders both the plaintext and key alphabets unnecessary in some cases, leading to their omission in many examples. In such instances, these examples simplify matters by utilizing solely the first row and column of the inner table as both the plaintext and key alphabet. However, certain scenarios might seem a tad perplexing. Consider this example, where B represents our plaintext and A stands as our key letter. What cipher letter would result from this configuration? In situations like this, a helpful mental model can come to the rescue. Rather than fixating on specific letters, envision columns and rows. Determine the cipher letter at the intersection of the column housing the plaintext letter and the row containing the key letter. Indeed, the correct answer remains B. Concluding with this final thought, let's circle back to Kryptos. Now equipped with a deeper understanding of Vigenère squares, let's scrutinize the square featured on the sculpture from an expert perspective. The first thing you might notice is that the inner part of the Vigenère square employs a keyed alphabet, using the sculpture's name, Kryptos, as the keyword. On the other hand, the plaintext alphabet is the standard English alphabet, just like the key alphabet. Additionally, there is a secondary plaintext alphabet at the bottom. This could serve aesthetic purposes to maintain an equal number of rows on both sides of the sculpture. In practice, you might encounter this secondary alphabet in many examples while it reduces the margin for error, especially when someone uses pencil and paper. Consider the following example. When key letters are placed at the bottom of the square, it becomes easy to miss the correct plaintext letter while tracing its column over a long distance upwards. Using a secondary alphabet might prove helpful in such cases. Also, observe that the inner part of the table shifts rows to the left. This signifies that our Vigenère square is symmetric. Therefore, it doesn't matter which outer alphabet we designate as the plaintext and which as the key alphabet, they can be used interchangeably. Thus far, nothing unusual has been discovered. However, this is where things become more intriguing. On the Vigenère square of the sculpture, we have 4 additional columns that, at first glance, seem to serve no real purpose other than aesthetic. These last 4 columns are identical to the first 4 columns of the key alphabet and the inner part. While they are identical, they do not affect the encryption and decryption process. It doesn't matter whether we use the first 4 columns or the last 4 columns, the result will be the same. So why were these additional columns added? One possible explanation is aesthetic. Adding these columns maintains an equal average column length between the left and right panels. Another explanation might be that these columns are clues, but their purpose remains undiscovered. Lastly, there is an extra letter at the end of the table, an L. This letter might also be a clue. While some people think it was simply a mistake made by Mr. Sanborn, as he omitted it from miniature versions of the statue. Therefore, some believe this additional letter is unimportant and serves no purpose. I hope that at this moment, when you see the transcription of the sculpture, it no longer appears to be a jumble of letters to you. You now know that the left part contains the ciphertext with the 4 puzzles, while the right part contains a Vigenère square, with a keyed alphabet employed in the inner part, and a secondary plaintext alphabet attached to the bottom. You will also notice the presence of 4 excess columns and an additional letter, whose purpose beyond aesthetics remains unknown. And now it is time to move to the most important section of the video. Let's solve the first puzzle from the sculpture together. Regarding the encryption method of the first puzzle, Kryptos K1 employs a polyalphabetic substitution cipher. If you've been following the video thus far, you likely already understand what that entails. For K1, the Vigenère cipher served as the method to encrypt the plaintext message. Some also consider K1 a keyed Vigenère. In this context, the Vigenère square from the right side of the sculpture was utilized, incorporating the name of the sculpture, Kryptos, as a key for the inner part of the table, hence the keyed attribute. The keyword used for both encryption and decryption is palimpsest. According to Wikipedia, a palimpsest refers to a manuscript page, either from a scroll or a book, from which the text has been scraped or washed off, preparing it for reuse as another document. One final note regarding the encryption method. Some individuals claim that the cipher method used was the Quagmire 3, which bears similarity to the Vigenère cipher. If you're curious, I've included a link in the description about the Quagmire 3 cipher method. However, ultimately, both methods yield the same result. Here, you can identify which parts of the sculpture are necessary for decrypting K1. Naturally, the ciphertext of the first puzzle, highlighted in blue, is required. As previously mentioned, we'll also require the Vigenère square from the right side, but only the inner section of the table will be utilized. We'll delve into that in a moment. Before that, as a first step, let's copy the ciphertext of K1. I have also copied the Vigenère table from the right side of the sculpture, while we need that as well for decryption. Next, let's write the palimpsest keyword beneath the ciphertext. As we've previously seen, we need to repeat it until we have a keystream of a similar length to the ciphertext. You might wonder why only the inner part of the Vigenère square is highlighted. In one of the interviews about Kryptos, Ed Scheidt, the CIA cryptographer who assisted Jim Sanborn with the sculpture's cryptographic aspect, mentioned that he integrated some dead ends to mislead and make the puzzles more challenging. One of these dead ends could be the expectation to use the outer alphabets for decrypting K1 as one typically would using a Vigenère square, like that on the sculpture. However, doing so will never yield the correct result, so don't make that mistake. This might explain why it took nearly 10 years for someone to decrypt the first puzzle. Instead, let's use the first row and column of the inner table as the plaintext and key alphabet, just as we have seen a couple of minutes ago. Now, let's commence the decryption process, letter by letter, as we've previously observed. At the first position, the key letter is P. We will use the first column of the inner table as the key alphabet and search for the key letter. In the same row, we will locate the corresponding cipher letter, which is E. Ultimately, we will determine the plaintext letter from the same column where we found the cipher letter. Moving to the second position, the key letter is A, and the cipher letter is M, resulting in E as the subsequent plaintext letter. Continuing this process, we obtain the following plaintext. Between subtle shading and the absence of light lies the nuance of illusion. As you may have noticed, there is a misspelling in the plaintext of the first puzzle. Let's concentrate on that next. The first L in the word illusion incorrectly decrypts to Q, indicating an error in the cipher letter at that position. If we were to encrypt the plaintext letter L with the key letter S, the correct ciphertext would be W. However, another possibility might be worth considering. Let's assume that the cipher letter K is correct and the error lies in the key letter. Therefore, let's determine which key letter would result in K if used to encrypt the plaintext letter L. The correct answer, in this case, is C. Despite the argument that the error likely isn't in the key letter, considering that we have correctly encrypted multiple plaintext letters using it so far, interestingly enough, this is indeed the case. The error lies in the chosen key letter. Let's explore why. In 2010, Jim Sanborn published the original encoding charts for the first 8 lines of Kryptos, covering the full text of K1 and approximately half of K2. He said if people would study it in a forensic manner, there might be revelations in there. On the chart of K1, the keyword palimpsest is clearly misspelled at the top. The error was corrected in the first 5 repeats during encryption, but then it was reintroduced, resulting in the seemingly erroneous K cipher letter. In an interview, Jim Sanborn stated that the deliberate misspellings, K2 also containing a misspelled cipher character, were intentional. He further emphasized that the specifics of the misspellings, namely which letters were misspelled to what, are of less significance. Instead, the orientation of those letters that holds more usefulness. Finally, I'd like to share one last thought before concluding this video about K1, specifically, the origin of the keyword palimpsest. As previously mentioned, Jim Gilligley, a computer scientist and cryptographer, successfully cracked K1 back in 1999. He employed a Pentium II computer to execute a brute force attack against the ciphertext of K1. In a brute force attack, one systematically checks numerous possible keywords, such as all words from a dictionary, until discovering the correct one, that yields coherent English text, while the others produce gibberish. Regarding this methodology, Ed Scheidt made certain comments. He hinted that while people may have unveiled the text of the first 3 puzzles, they accomplished this without initially recovering the keys. He also mentioned that these keys were concealed within the sculpture. Furthermore, he discussed how the code was designed in a way that allowed someone, even 15 years later and having forgotten the keys, to decipher it through clues present. He illustrated this with the following scenario. Imagine that you have an operative in place that you will need to get a message to in the future. It could be 15 years down the road. You won't have any contact with them in the meantime. You have to assume that they will not remember the key. How do you deliver a message in such a way that it conveys not only the encrypted data, but also the key? In summary, all the keys necessary to solve the puzzles, including the palimpsest keyword, are concealed within the sculpture. Hence, theoretically, exclusive reliance on cryptanalysis techniques wouldn't be required to decrypt and unveil the solutions of the different puzzles. However, to date, nobody has formulated a plausible theory regarding the incorporation of the palimpsest keyword into the sculpture. Therefore, classical cryptanalysis techniques remain the sole method to reveal the solution of K1 at the moment. And with this, I would like to conclude this video. Thank you for watching.